Angeles. She studied in the UK and got her undergraduate degree in sociology and social work. She worked for the National Health Service, and she worked there on harm reduction pilot projects before going back to get her master's in addiction and mental health. Amanda's worked in a multitude of substance use settings, from community-based mutual aid programs to jails, hospitals, and outpatient treatment, to creating infrastructure to set up and implement syringe exchanges. Amanda's specialty is harm reduction, where she provides technical assistance and capacity building to agencies. Her current role at Clear Matrix is the Director of Community Health Engagement, where she's worked on all the SOAR 2 outreach, which includes trainings on opioid and stimulant use. She's the chair for the Integrated Health Committee at the LA Regional Reentry Partnership, where she works on health equity for those impacted by mass incarceration, as well as a commissioner for Supervisor Sheila Kuehl on LA County's Alcohol and Other Drugs Commission. So please welcome Amanda, and take it away, Amanda. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Hi. Okay. So, thank you, Kathleen. Okay. All right, you can see my face. All right, if anybody's done trainings with me before, you know that I talk a lot. So I kind of apologize ahead of time. I also get very nervous at things like this, if you couldn't already tell. So, but thanks for having me. My name is Amanda Cowan. I use she, her pronouns. And we're just kind of going to be going over, fentanyl, and hopefully kind of looking at the narrative around the substance with kind of a bit more of a critical lens. So mythology has always been a tried and tested distraction from harder truths, and the panic, hysteria, and stories that we're currently experiencing around fentanyl really are no different. So every time we engage in these narratives, we're detracting from the actual conversations we need to be having. So I'm hoping that we're going to kind of talk about that a bit more in depth today. So the perceptions, of people who use drugs are largely influenced by the media and the criminal justice system. And so the portrayal of the effects of these drugs is overwhelmingly negative. And so we have kind of two narratives that are dominant of drugs and people who use them. One of interdiction, so linking drugs and crime, and the other suggests that the devastating consequences of drug use on an individual level are inevitable. And so I think many of us have really just internalized this narrative, and it's kind of time to unpack some of the stuff that we've been told. So the link between the perception of drugs, the people who use them, and drug policy constitutes kind of a vicious cycle. So under a prohibitionist framework, which we all work in, a person who uses drugs is engaging in an act that is illegal, which increases stigma. So that makes it really quite easy to discriminate against people who use drugs, and it enables policies that treat people who use drugs as subhumans, non-citizens, and they become kind of our scapegoats for wider societal problems. So if the individual is entirely to blame, then there's no urgency to address larger problems of inequality, poverty, breakdown of family, or any other social determinant of health. So the perception of how and why fentanyl comes into the United States has really given a lot of people a sense of permission to be openly xenophobic. I hear this all the time: open borders, we must close our borders. Fentanyl, I don't know if anybody else has heard that discourse. And that story really is just absolutely no different from any other war on drugs propaganda that has been completely set up and propelled by continuous racism. And so once again, when we have these conversations and we completely detract from the reality of fentanyl, blame is just placed on this distant foreign other, and we can detract move away our attention from the root causes that are actually born at home. So we're currently seeing this heightened through hyperbole around fentanyl. And so I just kind of want to ask everybody to keep this in mind as we walk through some of the current myths that we're currently hearing, and just kind of think about who has the vested interest in these conversations, who's benefiting from these stories. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of bad actors who actually have a vested interest that we don't even think about. I think I saw the other day a cleaning company that is now charging $30,000 to come clean after an overdose, right? So you have to realize that there are people that very much want these myths and these narratives to continue. There's a purpose here. All right, I have no disclosures. I forgot all this stuff. Okay, so some of the fentanyl myths that we're going to be going through is kind of naloxone overdose and response, exposure and spontaneous overdose, and then fentanyl and cannabis. And so some of the fentanyl myths, again, we're just going to go through this, unpack them all a little bit more, is just the reality. And I want to kind of ground and root some of these questions. So I want you to just kind of have these in the back of your head as we're talking about. Who is it benefiting? What are the unintended consequences? Who is it benefiting? Who is harmed when we have these narratives? And then what is the actual concrete evidence that we have? So just anytime we hear a story, what's the critical lens we can view it through? And so the reason we really need to unpack this is that there's a really significant and substantial cost with misinformation around fentanyl and fentanyl-related overdose. So just even over the last few days, the DEA has come out with a bulletin around rainbow-colored fentanyl. Has anybody seen that? Yeah? What do you think? Right, it's the boogeyman, right? It's was your candy laced as a child when you went Halloween trick-or-treating? But you heard it was. Same thing, right? We're hearing this narrative over and over and over again. We hear this all the time. So to me, when I hear that, my first thing is, oh, that's drug war propaganda just repeated, just packaged into a new, nice candy-colored package. It's not, so the statements are really never new in their material. Or they might be new in their material and their content, but the purpose is the same as any previous myth we've heard before. Additionally, I think a good way to combat this question or to have a critical lens is to think a seizure cannot verify intent. You can seize all the drugs you want, you can't verify intent around, because something's candy colored does not mean that it's going to children. So the reality actually is that the DEA is very late to this information. The DEA is really late to the party. Candy colored fentanyl has actually been around for a very long time. There's a ton of data ethnographers have seen on the East Coast about powdered fentanyl and the different colors that had come out for a very long time. And actually it was used for quite a while before fentanyl was kind of the dominant marker and it was just more fentanyl contamination. People were using it a lot to determine and be able to mitigate their own risk. The different colors kind of indicated strength and potency. People used it and they could tell by taste and texture. It's very different now because of powder. It's not as common. We're seeing it more in pill presses on the West Coast, but it was a way to differentiate batches. So this is actually nothing new. Okay. So fentanyl resistant naloxone and overdose. So there's a couple things here. So I think I hear a lot of times that we need a larger dose of naloxone to reverse an overdose. Anybody heard that or, yeah, okay. So it's an understandable concern. As a street drug supply is pretty inconsistent and it leads to unpredictability and potency that may or may not contain fentanyl or fentanyl analogs, leading to a rapid onset of respiratory depression. So with that, it is common to hear about the rapid administration of multiple doses of naloxone that is needed in overdose events. So this has led to this kind of ingrained belief that these overdose events required a higher volume of naloxone administered. But I think it's really quite possible that it's a misinterpretation of the event and sometimes a fundamental misunderstanding of how naloxone works. Complicating factors in overdose events that can impact the efficacy of any form of naloxone are the addition of other drugs. And so as Dr. Coffin said earlier, we have a drug crisis on our hands, which is multiple substances. And so at the moment when we're reporting overdoses and maybe overdoses that aren't responding in the same way, we need to think about, well, what else is going on? We have a really changing landscape of drugs at the moment. And so with continually changing adulterants means it's just a complicated overdose, right? We might have a harder overdose. There might be something else going on. So naloxone really just has always had its work cut out for it. But especially now when we have additional substances in the supply with things like xylazine and stuff like that. So anytime something contains a benzo, it's just a different overdose response. So it's really common in polysubstance overdose or naloxone to actually take a little bit longer to take effect, or for maybe more than one dose needed to revive someone, with requiring airway management and rescue breathing. but especially when the response time is longer and it's more difficult to revive someone. I just want to show as well, so these are some of the data, the research reports. Additionally, James Gasper, who's the pharmacist for the state through DHCS, has done a lot of studies around naloxone saturation. And fentanyl has been readily present in our drug supply since 2014. Overdoses are being responded to, and it's the same saturation, right? It's that 0.4 milligrams via IV is the standard hospital-based setting for the reversal of fentanyl for anything that's kind of anesthesia related. And so one of the common misunderstandings about the administration of naloxone is a higher dose or administering multiple doses in quick succession makes the naloxone work faster, or that the overdose reversal was only successful based on the number of doses that were reportedly used. But I think one of the questions we got to ask is, if you administer more than one dose of naloxone within the first few minutes, how are we going to know that that one dose may have worked on its own? And is it possible, it might be impossible to claim or infer that the overdosing person needed multiple doses if they were administered concurrently, right? So we're not even giving ourselves space to really know. And so that, overdoses are really traumatic, chaotic experiences, and they can really color the perception of the person that's reporting that information. And so most likely there was a misinterpretation of what transpired. And so there's a couple questions we can use to consider to attempt to see what happened in an overdose. How experienced was the overdose rescuer? How well does that person know the overdosing person? Did the overdose rescuer know exactly how much the person took of a substance? Was the person mixing substances? How quickly after the overdose did the person administer naloxone, right? How long did they wait? All of those things. And I think it's just also, again, to frame it, is that we've seen this discourse around naloxone before. When Narcan came out, or older, naloxone, more widely known in communities outside of substance use, it was really considered a moral hazard. People started saying that it enabled a riskier drug use, all of which has been debunked by data. And so stronger doses of naloxone on the market when more being developed. And I think it's really important that we look at that data and the anecdotal information around naloxone administration to understand what might be happening. So again, kind of maybe the overdose response wasn't reported as accurately, but more so my concern are with our population, is that the unintended consequences of higher dose administration of naloxone. So there's a lot of data that has come out when they do interviews with folks that talk about the higher dosing of naloxone, or kind of having several administrations of naloxone, that they talk about an unwillingness to potentially carry it for fear of it being used, because it puts them into such bad withdrawal, and that they might go use more sooner to negate the really awful symptoms that they're experiencing, right? So we put people in a higher risk category when we're doing these really high doses. Okay, so fentanyl exposure and overdose. This is my favorite myth. Everybody seen all the viral videos? The sheriffs, everybody? Yeah? No? Okay, there have been a few videos that have gone viral where folks in proximity of fentanyl have supposedly also had an overdose of fentanyl. So again, some questions to kind of lay out the framework is we'll talk about how did it begin, but who benefits from that narrative, what might be happening, and what are some of the consequences. So the myth of close contact fentanyl overdose seems to kind of have started in 2016 when the DEA released a video made in consort with detectives in New Jersey. So it told a story of two police officers who overdosed while handling suspected fentanyl. They said that a very small amount ingested or absorbed through your skin can kill you. And so the bulletin added, just touching fentanyl or accidentally inhaling the substance during enforcement activity or field testing, it can result in absorption through the skin. So the story spread like wildfire. And even Donald Trump's DEA released new guidelines in 2018, saying one myth is that just touching by any amount of fentanyl is likely to cause severe illness or injury or even death, and it's just not true. The International Journal of Drug Policy found no confirmed cases of fentanyl overdoses through the skin. However, this narrative kind of continues. So I think it's some of the things to think through Is this an innocent phenomenon where people are being harmed by misinformation that's fed to them? Or is it something more sinister that's being weaponized against people who use drugs and to increase resources for drug criminalization? So we definitively know that none of these stories have been a fentanyl or other opioid overdose. Fentanyl-related compounds are quite easy to detect, even in insignificant amounts in the human body. And all of fentanyl overdoses really have quite, if anybody's witnessed an overdose, they have quite identifiable features, right? So when you look at these videos and you look at what happens in an overdose, it's usually the opposite of what transpires in an overdose. An overdose, heart rate goes down. In these videos, heart rate accelerates. Pupils decrease, pupils increase, right? So a lot of times what you're witnessing is a panic attack, somebody having an anxiety attack. And so none of those stories have ever met the criteria for an overdose or shown fentanyl detected in the person involved. And so while the reports kind of feel like they have no sign of slowing down, we're seeing larger amounts of support that materialize for holding the media and law enforcement to higher standards of accountability. And so drug misinformation is so rampant and involves so much more than fentanyl. It really just affects absolutely everybody, whether they're using drugs or not. So there can be multiple things happening with this phenomenon. Perhaps some people are responding to misinformation kind of, we could call it a nocebo effect. We could call it Havana syndrome. Some people call it hysteria. And so we see this with the videos like the San Diego sheriff deputies. Anybody seen the dollar bill woman? A few weeks ago, she picked up a dollar bill that was folded. She supposedly picked up a dollar bill that was folded, and there was an overdose because there was fentanyl supposedly in the dollar bill. I saw recently that somebody was saying that there was an overdose because they bought a rose, and in the rose petals there was fentanyl, and they inhaled it just from being in proximity, right? So this is becoming this like absolutely rampant myth that it's everywhere. So, you know, we have these effects, right? These nocebo hysteria kind of effects, but fentanyl kind of has occupied, or at least my view of it is that fentanyl has occupied a space in our social consciousness as some sort of boogeyman. And so I think it's really important, you know, that we have a lot of just they're constantly kind of reiterating that fentanyl actually is a valuable therapeutic medicine and it's used safely all of the time. So it's not possible to overdose by being in proximity of fentanyl. Also, exposure does not equal toxicity. For an exposure to lead to toxicity, enough of a drug needs to be absorbed and get into the person's circulation for it to have an effect. So fentanyl can be absorbed dermally, but that's through the patch. And if anybody knows, that patch took so much money and so much time to figure that out, right? It needs a transdermal carrier. And that also that the patch takes 3 to 13 hours to reach the peak therapeutic concentration. So even if that was what was happening, right, we're seeing it and the time doesn't even make any sense. So common sense also invalidates the possibility of causal exposure to fentanyl relating an overdose. People who sell drugs and transport drugs come into environmental contact with fentanyl all day, every day, and we don't see this. We don't see drug dealers just dropping dead. I've never seen it. I don't understand how it's only DEA agents that have this and never a drug dealer who's died. I also think every anesthesiologist in this country would be fucked. So pardon my language, I forget. But right, that's always my thought is like, okay, let's just look at this from a critical lens. We would have no anesthesiologist because the job hazard would be too much, and every dealer would now be dead. So if we just come at it from that point. Also, if we look at how people use their substances, I have never seen someone go through the process of injecting a substance when they could simply take it and wipe it on their skin. So if we just even understand how the folks use their drugs, we could also look at it and go, well, that again doesn't really add up. And if you don't believe that, we can also refer to a report quite recently from a clinical toxicologist and an emergency medicine pharmacist. He accidentally spilled pure liquid fentanyl all over himself. He actually had a cut, a mammoth amount. Nothing happened. So again, the reason for the importance and the reason I kind of really want to push back on this, and these are, there are tons of statements out there that have been put out to refute this narrative. And then again, there's recent, that was the one about the liquid fentanyl. But we're working with a really incredibly high risk population who already struggle to get the vital medical care needed for them to survive. And this misconception only makes access more difficult. So fentanyl panic has real world consequences, including the delayed or lack of response to overdose because of perceived risk, as well as implications in funding allocation, legislation, and criminal charges. Multiple people have been incarcerated for exposing law enforcement to fentanyl. And in a society based on rule of law, it should disturb everyone that people are being charged with and punished for an imaginary crime. Okay, fentanyl and cannabis. Another one of my favorite ones. So we have a few things to think about. One is just kind of cannabis route of administration and fentanyl cross reactions, longevity of cannabis and postmortem, no confirmed reportings. And I think that, again, the takeaway question here is socially acceptable responses, or how safe are people to disclose and talk about these things. So fentanyl-laced cannabis products, ooh, now I got the mic to work. Fentanyl-laced cannabis products are a malevolent myth that have appeared multiple times in law enforcement press releases and subsequent media reports. These rumors seem to really start picking up speed around 2017 when a county coroner in Ohio erroneously stated that he had seen evidence of cannabis laced with fentanyl. It was later determined that his remarks were unsubstantiated and they were based on third-hand hearsay. So to date, there's absolutely no data, no scientifically verified reports of fentanyl contamination cannabis products. I'm not going to go into, because my brain doesn't work this way, but all of the research that's been out there just around also the heat cycle around cannabis and fentanyl. So fentanyl's boiling point being 466 degrees Celsius. And when they talk about, but kids are putting fentanyl in vaping products with cannabis and vapes, the vaping, the highest that it goes is 210 degrees Celsius, right? So again, it's just kind of like even looking at the information and going, that actually doesn't add up. Also, I think we probably need to parse out a little bit too, because some people say smoking fentanyl when they're actually, technically it is vapor because it's vaporizing, but it's smoking. But just to say that we don't see this, we don't see it in baking, we don't see it in edibles. Again, I think our numbers would be, our numbers are horrible of fentanyl overdoses, but they would be so much higher if it really was in cannabis. So we just have to think of it that way. But again, one of the questions that I really ask everybody to consider is, are people safe to disclose their substance use honestly? Or is cannabis a more socially acceptable response, right? So when people have tested positive for fentanyl and they've tested for cannabis, or families post-mortem with cannabis and fentanyl, one is that cannabis also just really fat soluble, stays for quite a substantial amount of time. So if we're looking at post-mortem and we also see THC cannabis levels, is that just easier for people to talk about, right? Is it easier to kind of blame it again on this other substance? A lot of people are more comfortable saying, or they're disclosing cannabis use than they ever would be disclosing fentanyl use. So it's possible that they used both of those substances and they're both coming up in postmortem. Okay, so some of the fentanyl realities is that we really do have a changing drug supply. We have an opioid naive, I say naive in terms of maybe that they're not specifically looking for opioids, youth population. And so it's really just requiring kind of am I doing some weird feedback? More honest and transparent communication. So fentanyl, the reality is it was synthesized in 1960 for breakthrough pain as well as end of life care. And really its popularity stems from its minimal cardiovascular effects, lack of increase in plasma histamine, rapid onset of action, relatively short half-life, and the really low cost. So where did it come from? So iron law of prohibition, right? Which was coined by Richard Cowan, and no relation to me. That would be interesting though, if it was a real line of succession. to point out that increased pressure on any illicit substance through law enforcement just inevitably leads to something stronger coming out. So once a supply is shut down, something else will shoot up in its place. So there have been previous reports of fentanyl in our drug supply, or different fentanyls in our drug supply. They really just were kind of popping up at various times when heroin was down or harder to source in certain areas. But they always left our drug supply. They never were around for a substantial amount of time. Now they've been around for years. It's not going anywhere. It is the dominant drug in our supply. And so while fentanyl really is, the driver of record opioid overdoses, it's also one of the most valuable therapeutic medications in medical facilities around the world. And so what makes it particularly dangerous in non-medical use, or at least unregulated or unsupervised, is its potency. So compared to morphine, it has approximately 100 times the potency and 50 times the potency of heroin. In terms of street drugs, heroin was classically 50% pure heroin and let's say 50% cutting agents. And so, when fentanyl entered the drug market, it kind of was pretty much sold as 1% pure fentanyl to achieve the same effects. But because drugs are illegal and they're sold on an unregulated market using limited equipment and without oversight or regulation, errors are going to happen all the time. And so when it comes to fentanyl, 2% product is a double dose. And so these minute errors were significantly less with drugs like heroin. And so with fentanyl replacing heroin on the market, 1% fentanyl, because it's 50 times more potent than heroin. And so when you look at that in terms of kind of like making a mistake, for your average street level dealer, if you're off by 1%, that's 100% increase in the dose of the drug, right? And it makes sense that we're then going to have these massive rise in overdoses, even without intention. And so just to kind of, again, if I haven't belabored the point, is that moral panic and fear really can't be outweighing the evidence here. Okay, so what are some of the tools that we have? Well, we have fentanyl test strips. We have naloxone. We have technology to support somebody not using alone. We have harm reduction praxis. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more. So not just the modalities or the interventions, but how do we talk to people and have a harm reduction praxis, that it's a philosophy in the way that we engage with folks. And then we have Good Samaritan laws. So I won't go too much kind of into the fentanyl test strips because I feel like a lot of you, maybe you don't, maybe I shouldn't assume a lot of you know how to use the fentanyl test strips or currently use the fentanyl test strips. But essentially the test strips are quite simple to use. They're inexpensive and they're really an evidence-based tool to potentially avert drug overdose. And so we do this with these single-use disposable fentanyl test strips. And so really what they're doing is they're just checking the presence, right, of fentanyl in the supply. So drug checking is part of a wider spectrum of harm reduction in which substances are analyzed to determine composition or to inform presence of an adulterant. And so when we use these fentanyl test strips, there's a few different things. Why would we give them out? Well, knowledge is power. It's an engagement tool, and it also just shows for overdose prevention potential. So there's a few studies that have shown that when people have tested their drugs with fentanyl test strips, that they've either used less or not at all, or used more slowly in relation to into injection drug use. But for me, I think passing out fentanyl test strips does a lot more than just a drug testing tool. So it serves as a tangible physical reminder for why your drugs need to be tested. So they function as a conversation starter, memory jogging prop, maybe, or a testing device. So if you get someone to test their substance, you've kind of already won a large part of that battle. So you've moved a risk from an unknown. I'm going to sound like Donald Rumsfeld here. Do you remember his known unknown speech? But I still love that speech. If you get someone to kind of, you've moved someone from an unknown into a known unknown, right? So establishing in someone's mind the wildly uncertain risk level that they might be taking because of just, we don't know what's in your drug supply right now. And so the test strip for me, and maybe this is for different groups and depending on who's using substances and for what, but for the test strips kind of really represent the knowledge that risk exists. It's like making this really tangible, we can see it, risk exists. And so other precautions then might occur to somebody to maybe look into other modalities or be curious about other interventions. For also, I think, and again, it depends on what groups we're kind of talking about with different substances, but for me and kind of the work that I do, it's been a really great engagement tool for folks who are not, traditionally don't use opioids. It's a way to really have those conversations. So it can connect a lot of people that use other drugs that might not go to our traditional, like maybe brick and mortar spaces or syringe service supplies, right? Because they kind of see that as something for a different substance. And so when we're giving out these distribution, if we have these strategies, where some people are like, where do we do them? Where do we give them out? How do we use them? Anywhere, everywhere. Like there's no, any setting that serves people that use drugs. And then when I break that down, I'm like, everywhere serves people that use drugs. Coffee shops serve people who use drugs. My hairdresser serves people who use drugs, right? So like, if we're honest about this, every place that any person interacts in society is where someone uses drugs. So for me, what I try to do is leverage my relationships outside of my drug world. So I have a lot of friends that don't work in substance use and have drug world. And I try to use them as best as I can. Where do they have space to be able to have a conversation and normalize a conversation that I don't have access to? So I have friends that are musicians. I have friends that work in restaurants. And I have just kind of like, I'm a little bit like a dog with a bone and I don't stop, but I have conversations and we move these substances and we move these conversations into places that maybe aren't traditional spaces. So can we have them, and I think this is becoming a lot more common, but how do we have them behind bars? How do we have them in all bathrooms? How do we have them everywhere? How do we have them at the front of a coffee shop? Because the more we normalize this conversation, the less it's taboo, there's no stigma and people actually talk about it. So we can go to all these different places, barbershops, gas stations, laundromats, restaurants, food banks, really just think outside of like, what are your community partnerships? Because I think we all talk about that all the time. Well, what are our community partnerships? Everywhere. My local coffee shop is actually my community partnership. So I have plenty of conversations about work all the time at my local coffee shop because I might be there on a bad day when I'm not in the mood for work, right? But whatever it is, and it's like you continue these conversations and dialogue and you build up a rapport and eventually maybe we can get fentanyl test strips at that place. And then kind of also just outreach considerations about who's the credible messenger. Using scare tactics, they just work. And that also, I think for, again, a really, really important point is that these fentanyl test strips or access to naloxone should not be contingent on people receiving services. That's not going to work either. We need it available. We need absolutely I know that for some agencies, no barrier is not possible, but we need this to be as low barrier as possible. And I think one of the really amazing parts of the DHCS DP project is that there's very low data collection, right? There's very minimal data collection that's needed. And so we really can try to create a network or a capacity and an infrastructure that is zero barrier. Okay. Just to kind of briefly say that there are limitations to fentanyl test strips. So again, I think referencing back to the fact that it is just kind of this like, hey, it's my Donald Rumsfeld speech. There's a known unknown. There's a risk that fentanyl test strips are fantastic, but we still need to employ all other harm reduction strategies. We still need other modalities. We still really don't want, folks to be using alone if they can. And so, because it's not going to pick up all fentanyls. Additionally, as Dr. Coffin also referenced in his speech earlier, it has a really bad cross reaction with methamphetamine. I also don't want people wasting their drugs. So a lot of times people will be like, oh, we'll throw it away now because it has X. And it's like, it might actually be a false negative, might be a false positive. There's a lot of different things going on. So even though we have those readings, we still want people to be able to engage with other harm reduction modalities. Also, it's not going to be able to detect benzos. So again, when we're talking about more complicated overdoses and other street drugs, fentanyl test strip's not going to pick that up. And then some people are worried about liability. I would not be worried about liability in California because we have fentanyl test strip distribution programs for our syringe services, despite drug paraphernalia laws, and federally they're working on changing that. One of the important things though about the limitations is the chocolate chip cookie effect. The idea is that it's not going to pick up, right? There might be fentanyl in some parts of it and not in fentanyl in the other part of the drug. So somebody might test their drug, but you don't test the entire substance, and it might be that it's here or there. So that's what I'm saying about false negatives. Okay. And then just kind of the CLIA waiver, why is this not required? And so basically because they were originally developed to test the presence of fentanyl in urine samples. And so what happened is harm reductionists realized actually you can use it, and people that use drugs realized, oh, we can use it to test if fentanyl's in the substance. And the CLIA waiver is really just on top of an FDA approved device. It's to basically say like, this is really easy to use, like pregnancy tests. And so a lot of folks just don't really feel the need to jump through the hoops because we're not getting it from the human body. We're not getting it from urine. We're doing it to test the actual drug. Okay, and then some of the just messaging to people who use drugs. So again, not using scare tactics. And then this is from Community Health Project Los Angeles. This is a sticker that they put on all their fentanyl test strips. There's a lot of those kind of around the internet. You can put those, but also just like encouraging people to maybe use other sensations. I don't know that this data rings as true as much anymore around anticipating effects based on color, taste, or sensation because it's changing so much, but there was that at a period of time. We can talk to people about route of administration, that there are some more protective factors in certain ways of using substances and staggering use. And then we can be purchasing them either directly through suppliers or through the California Syringe Exchange Supply Clearinghouse. Okay, and then these are just some of the studies that have shown that people did decrease their substance use. This was in 2019. There's no real updated studies from there. And it's now that fentanyl really is the dominant, it's hard to know exactly what's happening with the overdose with the test strips. But I think it is really fantastic for the folks that are not intending to be using fentanyl, right? People that are using, so it's not to say like fentanyl test strips don't have a place anymore. It's just maybe they've changed who the place is for. Okay, so my favorite conversation is kind of the communication and harm reduction praxis. So I think we have a lot of harm reduction modalities. We have interventions and we talk about harm reduction, but we talk about harm reduction in kind of this co-opted way. We talk about it in this like really sanitized version of what harm reduction is as a movement and is as a philosophy. And so harm reduction practice or praxis is a little bit different than these modalities. So sometimes when we attempt to do harm reduction work, and I'm going to include myself here, we're utilizing modalities and we're not looking at it, like I said, as this whole system. And so things like safer use education can be really, really well-meaning, and it is. But it might not be that it's going to meet someone's established needs, right? Or it's a repeat of what they've heard over and over again. So harm reduction includes being understanding and flexible, supportive and creative and non-judgmental. And so maybe an example of this is if you're going to be doing groups and meetings, having explicit conversations with participants about what the group desires and needs. So harm reduction as a practice avoids confrontation, arguing, power struggle. So we have supportive conversations that are hard and questions that identify the person's needs and wants. And so kind of to think about some of the places that we work in, like medical spaces, and I know that there's a tremendous amount of change happening in medical spaces, but medical environments are usually a very high risk place for a lot of our folks, right? And so they can be rife with discrimination and stigma, and it can lead to provision of substandard care. And we kind of have done this disservice where we believe that people who use drugs are kind of unable to make decisions for themselves solely based on their drug use. And we tend to focus solely on the person's drug use. And if we don't see somebody as something else, then we create a lot of damage. So we really need to kind of sit and ask the deeper questions. We need to see the complex life that somebody is living and managing outside of their substance use. I think some of the questions for us to reflect on as harm reduction praxis is when we talk about non-compliant treatment planning. What does non-compliant mean? Like, how do we unpack that? What does that actually mean? Are they non-compliant, or do they actually know what's best for them? Or maybe they the authority in their own life, in their own experience, and what's needed. Maybe talking about drug use, changing their drug habits don't really matter to them if they don't have a house right now. Let's really think about these things. So we do these, we look at these behaviors that people have, and we kind of pathologize folks, and we forget that they are trying to get their basic needs met. And so we see these like really big displays sometimes of bad behavior, and really it's an attempt to get your needs met. So if we create a system where people who use substances can't be honest about their drug use to us, or we deny them care because of their drug use, we create a system that kills people. So I just want to kind of, medical and social conditions and all the other things happen because of and outside of drug use. So we really just have to, I feel like, have that constantly playing in the back of our mind, that we can't be removing agency from our participants. So again, going back to non-compliant, is that maybe also just protest behavior? So I think of this a lot when I see maybe people in my neighborhood that are difficult or challenging for me, right? Because I might be witnessing like a severe mental health crisis that's happening in front of my face, and I'm not sure 100% what to do about it. I always try to also actually think of it that people find really creative ways to be seen. People are trying to reassert their agency when it's being stripped of them constantly. And so I think sometimes these behaviors are actually a really smart way of getting your needs met. You're going to be seen. I'm going to make you see me. So I think just really kind of thinking that through. If we're honest, we all have a relationship to substances. Abstinence or avoidance is also a relationship to drug use. So harm reduction isn't a hypothetical thought experiment where we're rolling the dice. It has a really, really long track record, and it's one of the most successful public health shifts in the last few decades. Okay, so let's see. So some of the, right, so again, so this kind of active listening, and active listening can be hard because it's also like adopting a stance of radical acceptance that whatever the person says, without interjecting, without stopping them, without this like reflective need to correct the behavior. Connecting the person to their power and their autonomy. What are their needs? What do they think they need? Providing the resources and the support which facilitate their ability for wellness, and for us to be honest about our capabilities. What can we actually provide somebody, and what can we not provide that person? What are we willing to fight for, and what are we not willing to fight for? There are limits to our capacity, and I understand that, but we can't tell people that we can do things we can't do, that we can offer them services we can't offer them. And that's a hard place to be in. But we can also be really honest and create a space for how hard that conversation is, to have spaces and talk about it with our participants. Like, this is the container we work in. This is the space we work in. We will fight like hell to make things different. And we have to know what we're up against. This is the one that I think for me, a lot of people have really pushed back on me with, or have a challenge. What is it that the substance provides that person? Instead of what's wrong, I'm going to turn that question on its head. What does that person get from their drug use? What is that person looking for in their drug use? I especially try to talk about this with parents. I'm somebody that was on Suboxone when I was 19 to 22. And so I had a history of substances before that. And I really wish somebody had asked the question, what was I looking for? What was I hoping to get in those things that I could not get from my parents, that I couldn't get from friends, whatever that was, right? Like, somebody's looking for something. So engage in kind of honest research-based education. What are our relevant harm reduction strategies? How are we going to keep up with new information? New information is coming out all the time. How are we going to keep up with it and disseminate it and reduce our stigma by understanding our own social conditioning and our own internalized bias and the rhetoric that we have grown up with since day one, and meeting people where they're at now. And so just kind of, what are some of our shared goals? We can talk about that with our participants. What is harm reduction? And so this is just reflective questions, I think, to take away, but what is harm reduction in practice? Like, what is the theory versus what are the strategies that we're using? And then this one, I feel like, how are we going to involve family into a conversation and our friends? And who is going to be trained in overdose reversal? And I asked my mom this question, and my mom, who is the most open-minded person I know, I said, okay, so if you were going to train, are you going to train a bunch of kindergartners? She works with little kids. I said, are you going to train kindergartners in Narcan? And the like face, right? And I went, what? And she was like, and it took a really long time for her to like sit with that, because first it was the heartbreak of having to do that and have this whole conversation. But I just ask you all to sit with that question of, where does that lie for you and why? What happens if we train kids in the lock zone? A lot of kids are living in families where their parents use substances. What does that mean? How old would we be if we showed them to use an EpiPen or insulin? Someone in their house needed it, right? So I think these are all things that we have to interrogate ourselves, because even when we sit and we think that we have the most liberal practices, there are still spots where we're like, eek, that doesn't sit well for me. So to constantly unpack that, why does that not sit well for you? What does that bring up? And that's a good way for me to understand, and this is what I do all the time as my reflection, is what is my harm reduction strategy and what is my harm reduction praxis, and where are they not congruent? Where's that misstep? And so, just to remember really that when we're in a room with folks, there's two experts in the room. Really, there's one expert in the room, it's them. We might be credentialed. We might have a lot of experience. We may not know a lot more about how the brain works in some ways, right? But the person that we're talking about, they're the expert in their life. And so it's really important that we give that autonomy there. And so last is, fentanyl is neither good nor bad. It's a molecule. So like all other substances, it's actually morally neutral. So there's a very heavy cost with misinformation. Our words have power. They have the ability to drum up fear and lead to substantiative policy implications. They can other and force people so far into the margins, they can be used to dehumanize one another. And so we have to remember that when we lose our people, we lose them in big ways. We lose them to incarceration or death. So, sorry. So I hope when we next come up against this incorrect information that we, sorry, I lost somebody recently, that we have the chance to stand in our power and really just paint a more honest reality. People don't have to die. We just need to stop it, that it becomes, people are so othered that they're afraid to reach out. So, stop crying now. Okay, I think that's my stop share. I told myself I wasn't gonna cry, and clearly I did not do a good job. Okay. Oh, is there where's the end code? I could probably show somebody an end code. Ah, the number you've all been waiting for. You had to get, do you like you had to get through crying? God, we really put you through it here. You have to get through her crying to get the end code at 7512. Okay. All right, I think we have time, like 10 minutes, right? For, wow, I have never ended a presentation on time ever in my life. And I'll take 10 minutes to tell you how I haven't ever ended a presentation on time. Are there any, oh, what did I just do? I'm still on, okay. That's okay, I'm gonna step away. I should never be allowed near technology. Are there any questions I could try to answer or find somebody that has an answer? Yeah, hi.
Yesterday, one of our providers sent out a message that at least two people, when they were doing street health, hit the emergency room and stated that they were having fentanyl overdoses. The thing they did was smoked, marijuana. The message was, be careful. There's fentanyl in the marijuana, which we've been hearing on and off for a long time. So I heard what you said, and, the easier answer would be, oh, that's nonsense. But if it's a myth, then, isn't there possibly some grain of truth in it? Like, don't most myths, sort of start that way? And so what do you say to that?
Variables here of like marijuana. So this also was one of the misreports a few years ago, where people said there was like an erroneous report because people reported cannabis, but what it was that K2, it was synthetic, right? So we have to remember, again, there's so many different substances out there, and there's so many things happening that somebody thinks that they bought X or did X and they didn't. So they might think they smoked marijuana and it had cannabis, and the reality is they bought some chemical crap that we don't know what it is. And so there's a lot, there's so many different answers to that. One is that maybe it's the combination of something that Rumsfeld again, it's the unknown substance we don't know about that could be a cross contamination with something else. And if it's not, somebody says I'm muted. Am I okay? Oh, okay. And if it's not, right, again, it's looking for the data. So there's never been any confirmed report. And so any times that it has been, it's like, right, we're not good at going back and debunking data or kind of publicizing the report once it's been like a runaway train. But even the crime lab report turned out that there was, it was a what was it called? Like there was a lot of missteps in the one crime lab report. So I would just always ask for data. Just say, okay, and keep an open mind. You don't have to be combative either. That's the other thing. Like I had to learn this the hard way. I can be rather combative, not to be so combative. Just ask data after.
When we're talking about cannabis, are you talking about it being cultivated with the fentanyl, or the fentanyl is being added onto it? Oh, okay. So, because I mean, it's been lifelong thing to sprinkle stuff on your joints. So, you know, but they're saying that it doesn't burn. It doesn't. Okay.
From stuff, I can happy to send stuff later. There's a really, really incredible at University of Austin, or at University of Texas at Austin, Claire, I'm going to butcher her last name, Zagrowski. She wrote a really incredible article on Filter about the different burn rates. There's a Forbes article that actually just came out about it. And there's quite a few things online that will talk about the actual burn rates. I think there was like a 600-page like thesis that came up recently around different fentanyl burn rates. Like, and it was just talking, and again, just to kind of show like this is not the legitimate, right? It just wouldn't happen. It transpire in that way. Oh, okay. Okay, great.
So I have patients who also snort the product. So if it was sprinkled on weed, it can definitely be inhaled in the mouth, correct? And smoked. That doesn't.
Okay, so when we're talking about smoking cannabis, that's inhaled and it's through your lungs, right? So there's not, and then when we're talking about vaporizing, like fentanyl vapor. So I think this is another good way to even look at it. I work with ethnographers who they study people that are using substances, and they literally sit next to people that are smoking fentanyl and have not gotten a high from it. And also there's nothing else happening. So there's not this secondhand smoke. There's still more data. I was reading a thing that said that they need more data around secondhand smoke, kind of around different things. But the way that it's suggested, I'm not a toxicologist, so I'm not the right person, but I am more than happy to send along every piece of information that I've ever encountered around this that really does debunk the data.
So it wasn't the smoking it. It's, have you ever smoked a joint and, you know, it comes through? That's what I'm saying, that they can obviously ingest the substance if they are sprinkling it on weed and whatever. But the heating has nothing to do with what I'm saying. I totally understand what you're saying about heating it up and all these things, but it wouldn't have to be heated to any rate to be ingested if you sucked it in through your mouth like you do your nose. That's all I was stating.
Just to kind of say, so if I'm hearing you understanding it though, I've never seen someone like breathe and like suck up like fentanyl particles come up and they swallow. Like that's the part that I think I'm not understanding. Yeah, but it's not a toxic level. There's no toxicity. There has to be a certain, right? You have to hit toxicity of something. So even if it was like we had some vaporized amount and it vaporized and there was a certain amount, that's not a toxic level. There's not a psychoactive level to that. That's a minute amount that if we're even talking about getting.
So thank you for your presentation. I'm looking at an article from NPR, August 3rd, 2020. Overdose reversal drugs gain support at music festivals, but not fentanyl test strips. And so would you comment on what needs to happen in our society for it to be not looked at as more of enhancing the habit, but of preventing something from happening?
On my 1 minute signal. So I don't know how I'm gonna possibly answer that in 1 minute. I have seen that. We're all working on that. A lot of us are working on that at the moment. And they're talking about why are these. So the problem is that it falls under drug paraphernalia laws. So It's just a lot of people are going to say, well, we can do X and we can't do X because, or we can't do Y because of drug paraphernalia laws. So there's a really big push with Office of National Drug Control Policy. I would link up with Drug Policy Alliance. They're always doing advocacy work. I do advocate. I mean, a lot of us do advocacy work and trying to get that moved out of drug paraphernalia so that that can happen. Yeah. But within California, that's not, you can, I mean, the ways that I combat it is showing them that like, actually this is being purchased legally through Department of Healthcare Services with syringe exchange. So they have figured out ways to circumnavigate paraphernalia laws. Yeah. 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 Yep, I know. LAUSD won't allow it.
So is that the same thing as a drug?
I don't know about, for me, it was never paraphernalia. It was always, so whenever somebody says liability to me, I always know that for me, it's coded for not liability, it's stigma. So a lot of times for us, it was the conversation was around liability. Yeah, staggering. So what I would suggest is if we can't do maybe the big structural things right now, like big school districts, we can all work on it, but we can do the little things in our own communities, right? How are we going to get these out to people, not at music festivals that are big and are actually watching? How are we going to do little music festivals? How are we going to find coffee? Like, just find your people in your community, because I promise you there are people that think the exact same way. Okay, I've got to wrap it up. But thank you all very much. And yeah, okay. Yeah, I did. And did I? It was. I managed to do that. Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate it.